Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business.
Hello, this is Dan Sweeney, Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business here on the University of Denver campus. This edition of Ethically Speaking will deal with the topic of disruptive technologies and corporate ethical responsibility. Uber's doing it in the taxicab industry. Airbnb is doing it in the hotel industry. Netflix has been doing it to the TV industry. Disruptive technologies are transforming business after business, sometimes using strategies and tactics that are not quite consistent with industry practices, and sometimes even violating government regulation. What are the ethical boundaries, if any, for new creative technologies whose major purpose is to disrupt established practices and behaviors? J.B. Holston is the newly appointed Dean of the University of Denver's Daniel Felix Ritchie School of Engineering and Computer Sciences. He led our discussion today and will be my teammate on this podcast. Dean Holston will bring 25 years of experience as a senior executive at Fortune 500 companies, as a venture capital-backed CEO, and as a serial startup entrepreneur of 6 highly successful enterprises in the Denver area. His recent position as founding executive director of the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network in Colorado provides him very recent experience with emerging technologies in the Colorado area. Dean Holston, we just finished a very active roundtable discussion on disruptive technologies and corporate ethical responsibility. How would you describe the idea of a disruptive technology? What makes a new technology actually disruptive?
It's interesting. The conversation about disruptive technologies has changed in recent days. I think the general view now is that we're in an era of constant disruption and we're always behind. It's not always technologically driven, but it's often technologically driven. The current conversation is about the pace of those disruptions going forward more than whether they're out there. So one of the things I think that emerged in the conversation this morning is a view that every organization, every individual has to assume that there is accelerating disruption happening now, not happening tomorrow. And many of those are driven by very specific technologies, digital technologies in particular. You have to plan your way, or at least be in a world where you've anticipated that not only are you being disrupted, but the pace at which that's going to happen is going to accelerate. Lots of very specific examples. You can look at Uber. That's now a company that has no cars and not that many employees. That's much bigger in valuation than I think at this point almost any car company in the world, right? Or Airbnb, which has no rooms and few employees again, but has a market cap that's bigger than any hotel company in the world. And in those cases, digital technology was the disruptive technology that disrupted those industries. And
you brought up an example also in the healthcare field, the same sort of thing.
That's right. Yeah, in healthcare, it's now possible. There are a number of startups that are very well funded that are reviving the notion of the home visit, or of bringing medical care to the patient at home. We went from 30% of doctor visits being at home decades ago to sort of 1% today. That number's climbing because you can now have someone like a nurse practitioner who doesn't even necessarily work for the company, but has capability go out on a house call with mobile technology, report back enough data that may be blood data or other to an expert via that mobile technology, who will then diagnose and prescribe. That expert's not on site. The person who is on site is a much lower cost kind of provider, but it's on site. And the company that's providing all of that is not a hospital. It's not an insurance company. It doesn't own any employees, because all these folks are only essentially contracting with it to deliver that service to some degree of time. It never controls the data. That's an important part of this as well. Those intermediaries would say, I never have that data, so I'm not subject to HIPAA regulation. It's just getting passed over, some secure line from a mobile app to the expert at the other end. And it's a fundamentally disruptive model with some interesting employment and other ethical considerations that is very consumer friendly for those that can afford it.
And it sounds like we better get used to it, because there's going to be more of it rather than less of it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks. JB, what sorts of issues might arise to challenge the ethical character of such technologies? What sorts of factors might cause a business or an entrepreneur to question whether or not the disruptive technology actually violates the company's ethical standards?
It's a great question. It's a lot more subtle than I think people think. So we had an interesting role play this morning where we had the group pretend they're all members of the board of directors of a Fortune 100 companies, and I posited that I was the CIO, and I came in and I said, look, we've been hacked. All of our customer data has been hacked. I can't tell you yet when we were hacked, and I can't tell you when it's going to get out, but I can absolutely tell you that we've been hacked. What do you want me to do? Well, it's an interesting question because the reality, if you talk to anyone in the cybersecurity field, the reality is everyone's either been hacked or doesn't know it. But there is no such thing as not having been hacked. And so if that's true in the cybersecurity world, then for every corporation, it's true as well. What's therefore the ethical responsibility of the corporation in a context like that? Should they set aside a contingency fund to cover the prospective cost? And if they do that, what's the disclosure obligation? Should they go out to their customers and say, I can't tell you when or the consequences or how bad or how much, but I can tell you it's happened, and so here's what you should do, or, which is a dangerous thing to do from a marketing perspective. You can bet the CMO in that conversation says, well, don't do that. Wait till the other guy admits he was hacked first, and then be the follower. It's an example of disruptive of technology disrupting us to the point where there are real ethical implications that aren't obvious until you accept the reality of the magnitude of the disruption.
You know, we also talked a bit about both Uber and Airbnb, and there's others who create a business model that's based on kind of the explicit violation of certain existing regulations in certain markets, insurance issues in Airbnb and the livery license stuff in Uber. How do these companies kind of think about that, or do they think about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it depends on the company. And I think if you think about the Airbnb example, I think you can think both about the various different constituent sets. If you think about the investors in Airbnb, they say, look, just maximize pace. We're making enough money. We'll hire enough PR capability.
We got smarter lawyers than they do.
We got smarter lawyers. We got more of them. We're growing fast enough. We'll just fight it on the front line. And oh, by the way, that's completely ethical because what we're really doing is we're enriching a bunch of folks who have apartment space that many of whom are lower income folks who had no other way of monetizing that. So we're a social good player. We're going to take that kind of position. And sure, we're flying under the radar from a regulatory point of view because most cities don't let people just rent out their apartments and don't have any mechanism to tax if they're doing, which has other implications, et cetera. But on the margin, it's a bigger public good, and that's by the way going to be our story. So if you're Airbnb, you think that way. But if you're Hilton Hotels and you see that coming, what do? What's the ethical thing to do? Do you say, well, I'm going to go create my own, I'm going to go buy them, I'm going to ignore them, I'm going to attack them? Because, ethically, I'm of the view that my whole control system around quality for a hotel room is a big part of my ethical responsibility to my customers. And they don't have one of those, or they don't have one that's as good. And yet, it's a business model that's a really attractive business model. So I think those conversations are happening, and I think they're happening in real time, and I think they're happening with a lot of scenario playing. That was one of the interesting parts of the conversation this morning at board level across every incumbent as well as every venture firm out there.
Well, there's going to be some very interesting discussions, probably already have been in boards around the country and around the world on these issues. We had a really very interesting and engaged group of business and academic leaders around the table discussing these issues today. What, in your view, were a couple of the most thought-provoking comments or questions that you heard during that discussion?
It was a great conversation, and I actually thought we went a long way. I think there were two topics in particular. One was transparency, and the other was responsibility. On the transparency side, there was a lot of conversation about, are we in a world where everything is so transparent that you just have to assume that it's going to be out there, or it already is out there and you don't know? Not just that you've been hacked, but that every conversation, if you're an audit committee of the board, just assume that every conversation you're having is going to be, and there are in fact SEC rules that are being promulgated that may require this, is going to be public. So if that's true, and if you're a millennial, you probably live your life assuming that's true, but if that's true, how do you have the right kind of of conversation about responsibility. How do you do scenario playing? How do you think through these things? And if you're going to be judged immediately for any thought along the way. I thought that was an interesting conversation. The other one that I thought was really interesting is, what's the evolving unit of ethical responsibility? Is it the corporation? Is it the corporation with CSR, corporate social responsibility kinds of activities and policies and committees, or in the world we're moving to, where folks are going to have 14 different jobs over their careers, they're going to have 7 different careers, they're probably more of a sort of individual brand renting themselves out piecemeal as a contractor. Is the unit of ethical responsibility of the individual going forward? And how do we, if it's more the latter, because that you are your own brand and you are your own employer going forward, how do we inculcate in that generation a sense of community ethical responsibility? I thought that was a fascinating conversation, and we talked about it particularly in the context of, for example, the Volkswagen example, where I think the interesting observation in that case was that the engineers within Volkswagen said, gee, we can game the system here by only having the software turned off, essentially, or turn off the sort of ecologically management part of the operation, except when it's being tested. But in places like Colorado, it's testing live time on the road from some technology, infrared technology that was developed by scientists here at DU. So they couldn't game the technology. There's this disruptive technology they could use to try to game the system, but there was this other disruptive technology that defeated their, and from an ethical point of view, it gets back to the transparency point. Why play the game? Where was the conversation at the board level of VW that said, even if we could do that, we probably won't win, or it's such a transparent world that we certainly won't win, and why didn't that conversation happen? So there were interesting conversations that touched on both the transparency question and sort of the unit of ethical responsibility question around very specific examples like that one.
Well, it's going to be very interesting over the next probably months, if not years, to see how the Volkswagen situation gets resolved, because I think it's going to set a standard for large manufacturing corporations going forward. Well, thank you very much for helping us understand these things and sharing it with our audience.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It was a great conversation this morning. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Good.
Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business.